at the end of Chris's talk. During this break, Chris will be signing his new book. And I don't know if he was going to tell you this or not, so I'll tell you. The book is called LSD and the Mind of the Universe, and it's based on his experiential work with LSD. And he got the publisher, they were going to publish it, put it out in December, and he got them to agree to put out an advanced printing for this conference. So this weekend is the debut of the book. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And I don't know if there's going to be enough copies for all the people that will really want this book, because I've read the book. I offered, because I'm so enamored of Chris's work, to write an endorsement for it, and so he stuck me in there with some of the other big shots that gave him endorsements. So I've read the electronic version of this book, and it's a mind blower. I'm not kidding. It is a mind blower. So give a warm welcome to Chris Bache, please.
Give me just a second, folks, to hook up my technology. Fingers crossed. Okay. Can you give me PowerPoint on all three? Okay. All right. Is this mic working? Nope. Is it working now? No. Okay. Mercury retrograde, right? All right. Okay. Oop, okay. Ah, yeah. Great. Okay.
We'll get it on this one as soon as we
Okay, thank you. All right, while the technology moves forward, it's wonderful to be here with you again after last year. This is such a wonderful community. When I was here last year, I spoke to you about a book that I was just finishing that I was calling Diamonds from Heaven. And it describes a 20-year journey of using high doses of LSD, 73 sessions over 20 years, to explore the structure of the universe. That book is now here. Do we have it? Okay, let's see. Do we have it here? Oh, come on. Work for me. Okay, let's see. Here we go. There it is. Publisher changed the title, but in my heart, it will always be Diamonds from Heaven. I want to say up front that I'm not sure that what I did was wise. Honestly, I mean that. I pushed myself extremely hard on this journey, harder than was probably good for me. But I've come through it intact, reasonably so, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with you where this journey took me and to share it with the world. And it's not because I think my experiences are in any way unique or special, but they are a particularly, I think, well-focused exploration of the structure of the universe. And I want to say clearly that I did this work not as a therapist and not really seeking therapy. So all honor and deep respect to all the psychedelic therapists in the room. Right? This is a different agenda. What I was primarily seeking, I was trained as a philosopher of religion. And what I was primarily seeking was an understanding of our universe as deeply as I could get by sinking deep into my own consciousness, and in those deep states of consciousness, exploring the structure, the deep structure of the universe itself. Now, I want to ground this story in the context of our collective psychedelic experience. Let's see. Is my mic on yet? Do we? This? No, this one. No? Okay. Sooner or later, it'll come on. I like to walk, but okay. Is it on now? It's on? Okay, good. Pump the volume a little bit? Okay. We have so many people working in so many different psychedelic mediums in this room, right? So many different substances, so many different forms, and so many different agendas. All honor to the psychedelic community and all the work that we are doing collectively. What I'm bringing to you today is the story of one particular journey into the universe, one particular method, one particular format, all right, which does not negate in any way any of the other dimensions that we're exploring. It is simply one voice in our collective expression. So, let's go into it. Let's see, I got 2 clickers here. Which one is going to work? Huh? Oh, okay, looks like this is a winner. Okay. This is my psychedelic lineage. My psychedelic lineage basically grounds in Stan Grof's work. When I was 29 years old, fresh out of graduate school, just beginning my academic career in Ohio, I met Stan's work, his work, Realms of the Human Unconscious, and then his book, LSD Psychotherapy, which is this fundamental manual for working psychedelic sessions. Changed my life, turned my life around, pointed me in a completely different direction, and it has become my entire life's work. Now, in terms of the sessions themselves, of structuring sessions, I want to emphasize I've never tripped. I've never gone to a concert on LSD. I've never spent the night, all night, tripping with my friends and talking about things. It's not that those are bad things. Those can be fine. But in my work, every time I took LSD, I was working in a very, very carefully controlled environment. I was isolated, I was in my home, or in my wife's office, I was totally protected from the world. I did always solo work. I didn't work in groups. There are advantages for working in groups, there are advantages for doing solo work. Just owning mine was always solo work, which allowed me to go to follow exactly where the experiences were taking me and to push myself in that direction wherever it would take me. In Stan's work, are we not getting? Okay. Come on. Okay. Clearly, 2 different therapeutic modalities that Stan outlined: psycholytic low-dose therapy, psychedelic high-dose therapy. Psycholytic low-dose, maybe about 200 micrograms, where the psyche peels itself layer by layer. We move into it layer by layer. Sessions up to about 100 sessions. Psychedelic therapy, very, very different therapy. Very concentrated, very intense experiences. The goal is not to work through all the layers of the personal unconscious, but to sort of blow through the psychodynamic level of consciousness and to trigger an experience of transcendence, an experience, basically they were trying to trigger near-death episode experiences working with people who were terminally ill, they were going to die, and they were working with the anxiety that they were facing as they were going towards the death. This form of therapy was limited to 3 sessions in Spring Grove Hospital, no more than 3 sessions. So I came along and I thought, well, okay, if it can be done safely 3 times, it can be done safely more than 3 times. And it can be done safely more than 3 times. But I found that it was a much, much more demanding protocol than I had anticipated in the beginning, and it took all of my resources to basically manage what unfolded in this journey. This is not a therapeutic journey. It's a journey of cosmological exploration, and therefore it requires something of an explorer's constitution. And it also requires something of an explorer's preparation, an explorer's position in life where you have the opportunity where you can push this deeply, this far beyond the edges, beyond the maps where most people have gone. When I got to the end of this journey and was writing up my accounts and was looking back over the whole thing, I realized, well, I thought I was just doing an extended course of psychedelic therapy, high-dose therapy. But what I realized was that this process that I had gotten engaged in went so deep and went so far and generated complications that were so intense, I had to give it a different name. So I call it Do I have it right? Psychedelic exploration. The method is the method of psychedelic therapy. Total isolation, always working with a sitter, carefully selected music, the whole works there. The difference is the number of sessions involved. For me, 73 sessions. I did 3 sessions at the psychodynamic level. I did 3 sessions, about 200 micrograms. And then after that, all of my sessions were at 500 to 600 micrograms. Right. Again, this is not a protocol that I recommend. I wouldn't do it that way again. I would do it differently. I would balance the plant medicines more with the synthetic psychedelic medicines. I would really only push myself periodically with high doses rather than pushing myself so relentlessly in that way. I have worked with psilocybin, I have worked with ayahuasca and salvia divinorum, a number of plant medicines. I did most of that work after I stopped my LSD work. But LSD in the Mind of the Universe is really focused specifically on what happened on this high-dose journey. I want to emphasize that the circumstances in which I did this work were kind of unusual in that they were very, very stable and concentrated and focused. In all of my work, I had the same sitter for all these years, the same set and setting, same intention, same location, all in Northeast Ohio. Same substance, same dose level, and the same recording process, always recording every session as completely as possible within 24 hours of the session. Okay? What this did, I've come to appreciate, when you stabilize your work in this way, when you eliminate as many variables as possible, and you're using the same methodology and the same consistency, it stabilizes the conversation that opens up between you and the creative intelligence of the universe. It stabilizes the communion so that one session leads to another session, leads to another session in a very coherent, intelligent manner. Even though you may not understand all the details of the continuity when it's unfolding, when you're looking out over a longer period of your work, you can begin to understand the patterns of continuity that you are in dialogue with, in a sense, a single intelligence in this process. I say that carefully because there's so many layers to this intelligence. There's so many forms of this intelligence. But in the end, when you see the continuity across sessions, you can't help but feel like you're engaging a single creative intelligence. Now, I kept detailed records of my work. I have about 400 pages of session notes, again, recording the session always within 24 hours, because you know what it's like. 2 or 3 days later, things are not as clear as when you do it right the day after. I kept track of all the dates of the sessions. I even plotted the astrological variables. Late in the work, I used astrology to choose the dates of my sessions. I was working on average about 5 sessions a year. Now, I worked for 4 years. I stopped for 6 years for reasons that are not important to go into now. They're in the book. And then I picked up for another 10 years of very intense work. I worked about 5 sessions a year. And so I looked, when I became aware of Rick Tarnas and Stan Grof's hypothesis of the relationship between the outer planets and transit astrology, global transits, and my psychedelic sessions. I wanted to study this, so I looked at that, tracked at those variables, and there's an appendix on that issue in the back of the living LSD in the Mind of the Universe. I keep wanting to say Diamonds from Heaven. I have to retrain myself. Now, the story I'm telling in LSD in the Mind of the Universe is not primarily a personal story. There was a personal story. There was personal healing. There was personal insights. But what I found was that when I was doing this work, the personal components generally tend to manifest in the beginning of a session and at the end of the session, when I was leaving space-time and when I was coming back into space-time. That's not entirely correct, because sometimes a whole session was spent in personal healing. But in general, after about the first 15 sessions, When I was at the peak of the sessions, as indicated in these large circles, in this series of sine waves, which represent a series of sessions, when I was at those peak hours, I was operating far beyond personal reality. Okay? That's the story I'm trying to tell in LSD, in the Mind of the Universe. I've dropped out a lot of the personal story because from a philosophical perspective, from a therapeutic perspective, that's relevant. But from a philosophical perspective, it's the large story which is the more important story. A lot of work at the medical level, at the therapeutic level, really focuses on ego dissolution, transcending the limitations of your physical body, entering into a deeper communion, into mystical experiences. What I found was when I did this work, it wasn't just one cycle of death rebirth. Now, in this image, the drop at the bottom of the circle represents egoic awareness, our time-space awareness. The line, everything below the line is physical reality. Everything above the line is transpersonal reality or spiritual reality. A lot of work, a lot of discussion focuses on that first circle, the death rebirth of ego. And that's an important place to focus. It is the fundamental transition. But what I found in my work was you actually go through multiple levels of death and rebirth. And it's not ego dying over and over again. You're going through death and rebirth processes which take place at different levels of the universe, at different levels of the creative intelligence of the universe. And the deaths and rebirths at the higher levels are different than the death and rebirth at the beginning level when you're shedding time and space, when you're shedding your identity built up in time and space. They're harder to describe because, you know, the levels of consciousness that you're born into in the beginning, you're born out of at the end. When you're being born into the species mind, it has a certain set of qualities and characteristics. But when you are shedding the species mind, when you are going beyond the collective psyche, when you are entering into archetypal reality, that is a different pattern of death and rebirth. Now, I use Stan Grof's categories. Stan talks about psychic level, transpersonal experience, high and low psychic, high and low subtle level, high and low causal level. That's a kind of convenient category. But of course, how can we possibly describe the full spectrum of the divine experience, of spiritual experience, with simply 3 or 6 categories? These are simply rough approximations which are useful in order to describe certain transitions that took place on this journey. When I got to the end of the journey and I was kind of working and crunching all the experiences and putting them all together for the book, I realized that I began to count up how many fundamental deep death, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. These cycles of death and rebirth are kind of really like toruses. You kind of break through, you open up, you expand into a new level, and then there is a sense of gathering in everything that took place, blowing through into another level. And then you explore that level, you become competent and stabilized states of consciousness at that level. There's a kind of a gathering in, and then if you follow the process through, takes you into yet another death and rebirth process into a deeper level. And one of the ways I kind of image this is in terms of a nuclear explosion. Now, this image triggers very, very deep responses in us, and it should. This is an image of humanity's insanity at one level, but I don't want to go there. I want to use it simply to make one point. When you go through deep, deep death and rebirth processes where you are shattering every level that you have known, and not only in Earth, but everything that you have known in some sessions, it drops you deeper into the universe, and it allows levels of reality to come into your awareness which were not in your awareness before. They were always there, but you were not experiencing them. And there is something like that that happens with a nuclear explosion. When this explosion drives deeper into the atmosphere, it brings out levels of the atmosphere which previously you could not see. And something like that happens with the LSD work or any kind of deep psychotherapy, deep psychedelic work. It brings you into levels that previously you were not aware of. Now, the dualism here is I want to dissolve the dualism now, because the nuclear explosion in the center and the levels of reality one is entering, or in this image, are two different things. Now, dissolve that duality, because when one dies at that level, you literally dissolve into that field of reality. You dissolve into that strata, that stratum of reality. But we're not talking about bombs here. We're talking about the universe, exploring the nature of the cosmos itself. When I got to the end of my work, and I was kind of counting up, out of all the deaths and all the purifications and all the purgations, how many core fundamental levels of reality did I go through? I counted 5. Here they are. First, the death of self, transcending our time-space identity, our egoic reality. After that, something that took place at the collective mind, transcending the individual mind, something is taking place at the level of species consciousness. After that, something that took place at the archetypal level, at the archetypal dimension of mind. And then, something that took place at what I call causal oneness. Now, oneness, of course, comes up many, many levels. Oneness can come up in the first ego death. Oneness is a fundamental truth, and it occurs in many different forms. There's something distinctive and unique about causal oneness, or oneness at causal level reality, because here you're dealing with, there is no outside to reality when you're in causal oneness. You are not experiencing oneness. You are in the condition in which the universe experiences itself as being fundamentally unified with no core divisions whatsoever at any level: physical, spiritual, reincarnational. It's a fundamental core oneness of reality. And then at the last level, what I call diamond luminosity, what Buddhism calls dharmakaya, the pure light of absolute reality. So, let me use these 5 categories and then show you how these lay out in the chapters of LSD and the Mind of the Universe, and then I'm just going to share some observations on each of these categories as we go through, just to kind of give a quick overview. Death of self. There's a chapter, Crossing the Boundary of Birth and Death. I'm going to go back into these in more detail in a minute, but just to give you where it is in the book. Now, there is a chapter 1, which is the chapter on methodology. It's a rather long chapter in the book because I really wanted to be very, very clear on the methodology that I used and some of the ways of working with psychedelics at this level. And there's a chapter after this called A Session Day, because someone had asked me, why don't you just kind of take us into a typical day and show us what happens? And so I did. I kind of wrote a narrative of a typical session day. But in terms of the levels of consciousness, those 3 levels of consciousness really kind of function at the death of self. Yeah. Good. Thank you very much. My wife is taking care of me. By the way, I didn't mention, I forgot, astrology, working with astrology and psychedelic sessions, really, really interesting insights emerge. My wife, Christina, is a professional astrologer, and she kind of helps me understand some of the archetypal dynamics that are operating in some of the session material. Okay, collective mind. There are 3 chapters that have to do with the collective mind, the ocean of suffering, sort of the challenging, purifying part of working with the species mind, deep time in the soul, an initiation into the universe. I'm going to come back to these in a minute. Archetypal mind. There is a chapter, The Greater Real of Archetypal Reality. Causal Oneness, the chapter, A Benediction of Blessings. Then we move to Diamond Luminosity, the chapter Diamond Luminosity. But before I discuss Diamond Luminosity, I have a chapter called The Birth of the Future Human, which actually describes a series of visionary experiences that started at the initiation of the universe and continued all the way into the final chapter, from session 22 to session 70. It was one of the most consistent recurring themes. What's happening to humanity? Where are we going? What is our historical time in history? What's happening at the deep structural level? And then Diamond Luminosity. And then the last chapter, Final Vision, where I was given the last, what I call the last of the great visions of the journey, and then the goodbye sessions, the wrap-up sessions. So let me go back and just offer a few observations on each of these levels. First, let me check my time. Okay, that's not bad, we're okay. First, crossing the boundary of death and birth. How many people here know the work of Stanislav Grof? Okay. Then you know exactly what I'm going to be talking about here, because this is the perinatal level of consciousness. This is that level that is the boundary level between space-time consciousness and first transpersonal reality. When I got into this level, I felt like a poster child for Stan's perinatal level of consciousness. Intense physical purifications, fetal sensations, reliving aspects of birth, tremendous psychological, existential angst, the questioning the fundamental meaningfulness of life, confronting the meaninglessness of life, and then eventually ego death, a complete shattering of egoic reality. The ego is a tough son of a bitch, but in the final analysis, it's not that hard to take apart. It's harder to heal than it is to shatter. It's kind of curious, but on these last two sessions, this is 2.5 years' work in 10 sessions. At the end of these sessions, the last two sessions, it just took me and snapped me like a twig. I started the day as a white, male, highly educated academic, obsessed with the meaning of life. It totally inverted all of those variables. It turned me into women of color, turned me into women at the laundromat with no prospects, turned me into women who had no interest whatsoever in philosophy or the meaning of anything, of life at all. Of course, it wasn't women that were the problem, of course, and it wasn't a lack of education that was the problem. It was the social identity that I had internalized and accepted as what I am. That was the problem. And the universe forced me to become the opposite of what I was and just snapped me. And when eventually I let go and surrendered to that experience, I entered the world of women under the arm of the Great Mother. And I was taken through the experience of hundreds and hundreds of women's lives. It was just an extraordinary transformation in my own experience. I wish every man could have the experience. And I'm sure many of the men in this room have had that kind of experience, of experiencing so deeply the inner essence and the inner experience of the so-called opposite sex. Now, I believe in reincarnation. I've written a book on reincarnation. I think we've all lived lives as men and women. But what was happening here was I was not being invited to reclaim my former lives as women. This was different. This was saying, where you are going, gender does not exist. Let go. And so I let go, and I entered into spiritual reality. What happened next, much to my surprise, is that things didn't get easier, things got harder. After going through a transition experience in which my compassion was expanded and open to the suffering of the world, I entered a domain of collective suffering and anguish and pain, which deepened session by session systematically, and it deepened for 2 years. It took 2 years and 14 sessions to go through all of this work. There was a year of the ocean of suffering before I stopped my sessions for the 6 years. I stopped for 6 years, and then I started again 6 years later under a different time in life, different set of expectations, and different astrological transits. But at the other side of that 6-year gap, the ocean of suffering started exactly where it had stopped 6 years before, which I think is a measure of the intelligence and the intentionality of the consciousness that's directing our work. When the ocean of suffering opened, at first I thought that this represented a deepening of my ego death. I thought I was being, kind of cleaned up more. And this is kind of implicit in Stan's theory. He recognizes and he's witnessed these collective ordeals, but Stan sees these collective ordeals, or at least he did. He saw these collective ordeals as being drawn in through resonance to ego death. All right? So it's ego death which is really the primary driver. And when you get into ego death, in the context of the collective psyche, you can tap into some of the suffering of humanity that's still stored in the collective psyche, and it seeps into your experiences through resonance. So I went with that interpretation at first, but what I found was that this went on for so long, it was so extreme, and it lasted for so many years, and it involved so many millions and millions of beings that I decided that this could not be correct. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that these sessions were not trying to sort of purify me or heal me or transform me. These experiences were aimed at nothing less than the transformation of the collective psyche of our planet. It was about healing the entire planet in some way, shape, or form. Somewhere in working with very, very intense states of consciousness, something happens that there is a flip, and what had started out in my mind as personal transformation was taken over by the work of collective transformation. Now, I don't think anyone did this to me. Nobody, it was no trick that was done to me. I accept responsibility for this. This is simply part of my karmic contract in this lifetime, and I think it's part of the karmic contract of a lot of people in this room. Right? The work you take on in your deep, deep work is often disproportionate to anything that makes sense in terms of your personal life story, even your personal former life story. Many of us get into work so deep that you have to open up to a deeper understanding of what's actually taking place in these sessions, especially at this time in history. If we were doing this work maybe 500 years ago, maybe not so. But at this time in history, the work of the hour is collective transformation. Our species is going into a near extinction event. We do not have time to fuck around. This is serious work here. And if you're open, and willing to let this work come through, and I'm not saying everybody should be, and I'm not saying that it's necessarily a healthy thing. In many circumstances, it can be overwhelming and it can be intimidating, and you do not want to go there. But if you're open, and if you're capable, and if it is part of your karmic contract, the work we do in these deep sessions, I think there are more bodhisattvas on this planet than we might think initially. The work we do is for our collective transformation. Now, in my experience, working at high doses, every session kind of breaks down into two phases. There's a purification phase and an ecstatic phase. There's kind of the the dark, hard, death-dying kind of phase, and then there's the ecstatic phase. If you, in reference to this work, James' excellent talk this morning about shadow work and engaging the shadow, in working as I did in a non-therapeutic modality, one of the great gifts I learned from Stan Grof is to completely, absolutely surrender to whatever is taking place in your sessions and let it take you as far as wherever it wants to take you. Now remember, these are not tripping. There's no confusion in the outer world. There's nothing going on in the outer world that's getting into my inner space. I know that anything I am confronting is coming entirely from within or through within. If you submit, my experience is, if you submit completely to whatever's taking place in that context, it will take you deeper and deeper. It'll take you into sometimes unspeakable anguish and completely inexplicable anguish, into chaos, into just terrible suffering, confusion. But if you let it do that, eventually that will come to a crescendo, it'll peak, and then it'll take you through to something that lies on the other side. You enter into the ecstatic phase of the session, into the teaching phase of the session, into the cosmological phase of the session. Even if the next session you may come back around and enter back into the suffering again. But if you go through this process, into this surrender, death, and rebirth process, and let it take you, there is a deeper, deep underlying dynamic that's maybe not be clear to you at the time that unfolds itself over time. Often, you cannot understand what's happening to you in the pain part of a session. You cannot understand the logic of the pain until you have moved on to the next stage. Because often these transformations, it's not until you're looking from a higher state of consciousness that you can understand what you were engaging at this lower state of consciousness. You understand? It's really important to follow this all the way through, because if you follow the pain all the way through, what happens is you go from suffering to resolution to peace. And what you internalize, therefore, is the entire cycle. And this is what prevents the suffering from being lodged in your system as unintegrated trauma or some kind of something you have to deal with. I have gone through terrible, terrible suffering. I don't have any negative ramifications or after effects of that suffering, because you internalize the suffering, resolution, peace. Suffering, resolution. You learn to trust the cycle, and to trust that there is an intelligence that's behind this dynamic process. When I came out of the ocean of suffering in that first year's work, I was spun into what I call deep time. And I was given the experience for 1 year, 7 sessions, over and over again, consistently, methodically laying out. I experienced the whole of my life from beginning to end as a simultaneous now. Deep time. I called it whole time first, and then I called it deep time. Deep time is not eternity. It's not timelessness. That's something different. Deep time is moving into a state of awareness where you can experience different spans of time as simultaneously present. I experienced all the time moments of my life as simultaneously present, and I experienced it like a tree. The deepest themes of my life were the deep branches which had been the biggest branches which had received most of the energy. My most recent experiences were the leaves at the edges of the, before I died, were the leaves at the edges of the tree, but all of them being simultaneously present. When I first went into this state in the 11th session, when I came out of it, I couldn't remember it. It was the most meaningful experience of my life, hours before, but when I came out of it, I could barely reconstruct the edges of it. It took me months to recover the pieces of the session. But what I found was, if you go back again and again and again at that edge to your living edge in your sessions, what I found was you understand more. You're able to remember more. Things that didn't make sense in the beginning begin to make sense. The pieces begin to cohere. Fragments become integrated gestalts. This is an important epistemological point. When you break through into a new level of consciousness, you often get fragmented. You can't maintain coherence because you're in a totally different cognitive reality. But if you go back with clear focus and intent and clear setting, isolation, clear setting, you go back again and again, you learn to be aware in levels of consciousness that in the beginning just swallowed you. I learned how to stay conscious in deep time. And this is something which happened again and again. When I would break through to a deeper level of consciousness, there was often a fragmented quality. I couldn't remember. I could only get details. I'd hold on to details. But over time, those details began to coalesce. They began to become complete patterns of understanding. Reincarnation was this whole inside of my life from beginning to end was all kind of saturated with insights of karma and the intentionality, the deeper intentionality that binds us into the world of time and space. I wrote life cycles, not mentioning psychedelic work. My first book, Life Cycles, is about reincarnation and the web of life. For me, reincarnation is just a fundamental axiom. If you don't understand reincarnation, then you just don't understand what the hell's going on in this world. You just have to see the deeper patterns. Six-year break. Had 2 more children, wrote a book, got promoted. 6 years, started again. Ocean of Suffering starts exactly where it had stopped before, but now in the ecstatic portion of the sessions, totally different world. It started me completely beyond personal reality. I was given a series of 7 initiations into the universe. It was as if, it was not as if, it was the creative intelligence, some creative intelligence took me and basically gave me a course in Cosmology 101. It just took me through and gave me a series of experiences that deepened my understanding of what's going on in the universe. Now, I give each of my sessions a name because I'm trying to hold all of my sessions in my mind all at the same time. So I give them a name that reflects the pith of the session, and I actually will break my sessions into bullet points as well. So here are the names of the sessions that I deal with in the chapter, The Initiation into the Universe. The first You and I Creating was an exploration of the co-creation of the universe. I won't go into the details. It's so tempting. I can't go into the details. Just the book. The Cosmic Tour was just an extraordinary tour of the universe. This intelligence that took me somewhere, would show me things, show me how things were working. Sometimes I didn't understand. It'd come back for me and everything would get bigger and then I would understand and it would take me on. It was just an extraordinary journey. Council of Elders was actually a session which was teaching me how to keep my cognition coherent with respect to levels of reality. It's really important. When you have a substance that allows you to break through multiple levels of reality, you have to train yourself to keep your experience coherent with respect to levels of reality. Okay? That was part of a training exercise. Dying into oneness was an experience of just repeatedly dying in deeper and deeper death by death, deeper into oneness. The master plan I'll come back to. Healing the collective wound was basically a kind of an orgy of pain and suffering. And then I was spun deep into archetypal reality, and the collective suffering, the ocean of suffering, never returned. It never returned. Now, it's not like the world isn't suffering. It's not that there isn't pain in the collective psyche, but my work with the ocean of suffering was time limited, and we went on to another level. And what I learned later is that you don't abandon your species when you go deeper beyond the ocean of suffering or deeper beyond the pain of the species. You actually become more useful to it. In the beginning, you're sucking pain out of the collective psyche, but later you're pouring grace and joy and insight into the collective psyche from higher levels of consciousness. I have to speed up. I'm getting the time signatures here. The greater real of archetypal reality. When I entered archetypal reality, my identity as a human being began to fall away from me. I found out that we have an identity, a deep, deep visceral identity, which is deeper than our individual egoic identity. And to die as a human being is deeper than to die as an individual human being. And if, in order to go into archetypal reality, I had to literally cease to function at a cognitive level that had anything to do with human cognition. I had to be willing to give that up in order to learn how to acclimate into flows of reality that were radically, profoundly beyond not only my individual existence, but beyond human existence. I moved outside the human field. 2 levels of archetypal reality, one high Platonic level where I experienced something like what Plato is pointing to, except that Plato describes archetypes as eternal forms in the mind of an unchanging God. That's not how I experience them. I experience them as vast, living, massive beings that were just so overwhelmingly, I could not wrap my mind around them. They're just totally beyond my capacity to comprehend. I could touch them, experience pieces, but they just were far, far too large. At a lower level of archetypal reality, at a lower subtle level, entering deep into the collective unconscious of humanity, deep into the species mind, experiencing patterns experiencing the human species as a single being, and experience networks of intelligence weaving together our individual efforts, our individual minds, our individual karma into larger patterns which were how the species as a whole lived and breathed. I think I was being given a crash course on how our species works as a single organism in order to prepare the way for what came next. At archetypal reality, here are the sessions that I address. And notice how much cleansing is taking place at this level. The 28th session was an extraordinarily positive session. It was my first contact with causal level reality, tremendous ordeal, but then spinning out into causal level reality, incredibly beautiful, clear, gorgeous experience. The next 3 sessions were just grueling ordeals of purification. They went on for hours and hours and hours. It lasted 3 sessions over 6 months. What I came to understand eventually is that deeper states of consciousness are higher states of energy. When you shift into a deeper state of consciousness, you are entering a higher level of energy, and you have to acclimate to that energy. And that takes time and work. You have to go through a series of purification processes, cleansing processes. And it's hard to describe because they're not personal purification processes. You literally have to purify whatever you are at the time in order to stabilize consciousness at these deeper levels of reality. And this repeats itself over and over again, so much so that I came to dread the session after a breakthrough session. When I have a breakthrough, the next session was usually a turgid, carrying out the garbage kind of quality, right? But you go through that, you go clean it up until you can come back into that level of consciousness and maintain coherent cognition at that level of consciousness. I began to have experiences of reincarnation as a collective process. I began to experience the human species as a single organism that was growing itself, evolving itself, by incarnating all billions and billions of its precious beings simultaneously. I began to understand certain patterns of reincarnation as an evolutionary driver, not just as I had always thought of reincarnation as an individual story. The individual person grows, matures, makes individual choices, hopefully good choices. But here I began to experience reincarnation as an evolutionary driver, an evolutionary dynamic that operated at the collective level simultaneously with the personal level. And at that point, the wall between personal karma and collective karma came down completely. And I realized that there is no such thing as private personal karma. Personal karma and collective karma are all deeply intertwined. And I wrote Dark Night, Early Dawn in order to answer the question, why did my suffering go as deep and as long as it did in my sessions? And the answer is because at this deep level of consciousness, the boundary between the individual and the collective becomes very, very porous. And if you are willing to, you become an agent of collective transformation in this process. Hurrying right along. After a year and a half and a year and a half and 11 sessions at the archetypal level, I entered into a year of extraordinary blessings. I entered into causal oneness. It was just non-stop joy. There are 4 sessions that I address in the book describing this. The forest, the birth of the diamond soul, singing the universe away in Jesus' blood. The first one is experience of oneness, shunyata, emptiness, no self in me, no self anywhere in the world. Singing the universe away was an experience of entering into the primal void, what Stan calls the metacosmic void. The domain of the formless, out of which the light emerges that actually gives birth to the physical universe. Jesus' blood was an experience of extraordinary cosmic love, just being loved like I've never been loved before in this lifetime. The birth of the diamond soul, let me pause just for a second there because it's really important. 11 years before, I had experienced my life as a totality from start to finish. Now I began to experience all my former lives coming together. They were just coming in fast and furious, and it was like wrapping a filament of white light around a kite spool. And at a certain point, when they hit critical mass, and when they hit critical mass, they fused. And when they fused, they exploded into a diamond light. It was my first contact with what I came to call diamond light. And it was an experience which was showing me where reincarnation is taking humanity. Not exactly where, but how it works. Reincarnation is not simply making incremental improvements in our life, lifetime by lifetime, adding a layer, adding a layer. It's true, we do. But at a larger level, sooner or later, if we keep this process up, we die, we remember who we are. We're born, we forget, we learn. We die, we remember. We're born, we forget, we learn. If we keep this up, lifetime after lifetime, sooner or later, the soul, the larger consciousness that holds all of our lives, wakes up inside time and space. Not just in the spiritual reality that we return to when we die, but it wakes up inside time and space. That I call the birth of the diamond soul, just to put a language to it. Other people have spoken about this. I think it is, in a sense, spiritual awakening in the deepest sense. It is the emergence in history of a fully integrated being that has integrated hundreds of thousands of years' experience and has now been jumped into a higher level of awareness and functionality with tremendous expansion of compassion for other human beings because we've had so many lifetimes of experience with each other. And a profound transparency to the universal creative intelligence. It is a turning point in the evolutionary story. I'm being pushed on time, and absolutely right to be so. And this is the most important chapter of the book, the birth of the future human. When I started this work in '79, I didn't think much about the future of the human race. I didn't really understand much about the ego crisis we were going into. This is 1979. And yet this became one of the most consistent, recurring themes of my work, a series of visionary experiences that kept showing me over and over and over again, humanity is coming to a turning point. Humanity is coming to a profound revision of its foundation. Humanity is coming into a time of great awakening. Over and over again, great awakening, the turning point of history, a before and after moment in time. The Visions of Awakening is a collection of 6 visions that I pull out of different sessions. I just group them together in order to tell the story in a coherent fashion. But I had not been shown how the universe was possibly going to pull this off. How were we going to make this transition? And then a year and a half later, I went into session 55, the Great Awakening session, where I was taken deep into deep time, but not personal deep time, deep into collective deep time. And I went into the future and I experienced the death and rebirth of our species. I wasn't a human being when I experienced this. I had merged into the field of the collective psyche, and I experienced this crisis in history as the species will experience it. I experienced a crisis that brought us to our knees, a deep and profound unraveling, a shattering of life as we had known it, a profound, frightening time. But out of this process was born an extraordinary being, a transformed humanity, a shift in the fundamental blueprint of the human psyche. And this was being done not at the surface level, but at the deep level of the collective unconscious. This was a shift in the blueprint of our species. I was also given a series of initiations into how this was actually going to be pulled off. And I don't have time to go into it. Maybe at the workshop retreat I'll be doing next week, where we talk. It has to do with understanding the dynamics of the collective psyche, understanding nonlinear systems, understanding how systems how systems function when they're driven into nonlinear states. We have a good understanding of what happens to physical systems when they're driven into nonlinear states. Well, the human species the human unconscious is a fundamental unified psychic field. My sense is that the great suffering that we are entering is going to be so widespread and so long-lasting, it will literally energize the collective psyche as never before in human history. And when it is energized by such terrible suffering, it will be capable of transforming itself in an historically unprecedented manner. And it will give birth to the future human. And I believe that the future human will be the diamond soul. Our future is already encoded in our past, meaning that nature has been preparing us for this event, has been preparing for us for hundreds of thousands of years. We have been growing. We have been collecting information, collecting experiences, going forward, going deeper. Gestation is a long process. Birth is a relatively fast process. Reincarnation has been gestating the future human for generations after generations after generation. We are coming into the time of birth. It's a hard time. It's a scary time. It's a near-death experience kind of time. But it's a process, I think, which is giving birth to an extraordinary creature, just an extraordinary creature. All right, my time is used up, so I have to just pop this very quickly. The diamond luminosity. Will you give me 5 minutes of your break? Okay. When I finished the greater reel of when I finished the benediction of blessings, I felt completely satisfied. I felt like I had given something in the ocean of suffering work, and I had been rewarded by more than I could possibly imagine. I felt completely at peace. I had known oneness. I had been drenched in cosmic love. What more could you ask for? But there was still 5 years of work to go. After going through yet one more very, very intense death and rebirth process at a cosmological level, I was spun into the domain of absolute transcendent clarity, light as I had never known light before. Absolutely, absolutely clear. Just the Buddhists are right. Just touching it once can undo centuries of wandering around lost in samsara. Extraordinary purity. Dissolving into the crystalline body of the divine, becoming light. Becoming light. Your mind completely dissolved into the light, which is the primal light before existence, before physical existence manifests. The sessions, there were, out of 26 sessions over 4 years, I entered this reality only 4 times. 4 times in 26 sessions. In between those 4 times, more purification, more purgation, just tremendous cleansing, and also interesting healing, personal healing, which really surprised me because I would have thought personal healing would have come sooner. But here I was suddenly involved in personal healing after years of working at the collective level, and it took me a while to understand why things were unfolding in this order. Not time to talk about there, but there was a logic to it. There was an intention to it. I entered into the diamond luminosity 2 times. I went into deeper and deeper into the diamond luminosity, and then the last 2 diamond luminosity experiences were not about going deeper into the universe. It was about the diamond luminosity crunching itself deeper and deeper into my physical body, crunching itself into my psyche, into my psychological awareness, but literally going right into my physical body and changing the physiological structure of my cells. That's what it felt like. And the pivot came in the middle when I was in the 50th session, and extremely, the deepest I ever went anywhere in the universe. So I was in this blissed out, incredibly beautiful place. And all of a sudden, everything pivoted 90 degrees. And I saw a reality that was extremely far in the distance. I saw whole worlds in the far distance. And a light hit me from that reality. I call it the absolute light, just to differentiate it, call it something. It hit me and it absolutely shattered me. And that's when I understood. This is an endless journey. I had picked up the idea, I had believed that this journey, you do it to get somewhere. There is an end point to the journey. You get home. And it's either oneness with God or entering in the primal void, but there's an end point. At this session, I let go of that idea, and I realized it's an endless journey. The infinite is much, much larger than any of our spiritual traditions have ever been able to grapple with yet. It is an infinite process, and that's why I would be much gentler with myself if I were doing this work again. I've learned that the process is not to try to get to the end of the line. The process is simply open up, let as much of the creative intelligence of the universe into you as you possibly can, let it transform you, let it break your heart and open your heart, and then be patient with the slower pace of our organic transformation. Right? The final vision gave me one last vision, the final capstone of the entire 20-year journey. It was the capstone of the birth of the future human. It took me deep. Put me through a terrible strip down. Took me deeper into time than I had ever been taken before, and it gave me an intimate experience of the future human. It gave me several different lessons, and it gave me an experience of the universe as a diamond maker. I experienced a swamp, a very dark kind of mud, which is represented the topsoil of reincarnation, where everything, all individual life forms were dissolving, reconstituting, dissolving, reincarnating, dissolving, reincarnating. And then there were these sparks of bright light shooting off into the universe. These were diamond souls. These were fully integrated souls moving into the universe, centers of integration capable of integrating more and more levels of consciousness that the ego alone could never integrate. The universe is a diamond maker. The universe is growing sparks of diamond luminosity, and it makes no difference to it, or it makes a difference, but it makes no difference whether it takes 1 billion years or 1 million years for this process to come to fruition. It is a very, very patient process. It has created the cauldron of creativity, and it is taking us deep, deep into places that we can only imagine. The last session, the last chapter, is coming off the mountain, which I won't talk about, but I learned that coming off the mountain was as hard as going up the mountain. Walking away from such intimacy with the divine, walking away from such profound immersion into the divine reality, is hard. Once you have known the joy of dissolving into light, time and space can begin to feel kind of dried up. Not very interesting. It took me 10 years to really get back into time and space, to be grounded, to be comfortable being who I am, what I am, for the remaining years of my life here. I don't know whether I would have been able to make it back fully if it had not been for the love of my wife, Christina. Thank you for letting me share this story with you. It's a joy to bring it to this particular community. We're going to be doing a workshop Friday, Saturday, which I hope we'll have more time to go into it. And one of the things I want to experiment with is, can we use guided visualization to open these places which are universal? They lie in everybody's hearts and everybody's experience. In addition to having a conversation about psychedelics and protocols and methodology and the different experiences that different people have gotten into, in addition to that, we're going to explore using guided imagery and deep relaxation to sort of activate some of these deep places inside that live inside each of our hearts. Thank you very much.